Girl with cancer helps wheelchair-bound man in the rain, but 2 days later, she discovers he's a billionaire. And what he does to repay her kindness will bring you to tears. Subscribe to the channel to support my work and comment what country you dream of visiting. The dark, heavy sky poured an icy rain over the city of Chicago. On the 3rd floor of a dilapidated old building, the Hope Haven orphanage kept its lights on, although the atmosphere inside was as bleak as the storm battering its windows. Emily, a 9-year-old girl, sat on the sill of a large window in the communal dormitory, her brown eyes lost in the darkness outside. Her fragile body trembled slightly, not only from the cold seeping through the poorly sealed window, but also from the fever that never fully left her. The dormitory was silent at this hour. The other children were already asleep in their beds, but Emily couldn't rest. The pain in her body was constant, like tiny needles pricking her from the inside. Her hair, once long and brown, was now just a memory. The cancer treatment had taken it away, leaving only a colorful scarf that a kind nurse had given her to cover her head. A rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, making the walls of the old building shudder. Emily adjusted the thin jacket over her shoulders, trying to warm herself. Her eyes caught a movement on the deserted street below. A man in a wheelchair was stopped in the rain, seemingly disoriented. He tried to move, but the wheels of the chair seemed stuck in a pothole in the asphalt. Emily watched for a few moments, hoping someone would help him. A car passed, then another, but no one stopped. The man remained there, alone, the rain soaking his clothes. Without a second thought, Emily climbed down from the windowsill. Her legs trembled as she touched the floor, but she ignored the weakness she felt. Silently, she crossed the dormitory and reached the hallway. She knew she shouldn't be out, especially at this hour. If Mr. Johnson, the night shift worker, caught her, she would be severely punished. He was known for his cruelty, especially towards the most vulnerable children. Emily descended the stairs carefully, holding onto the handrail to avoid falling. Each step was a challenge for her weakened body. When she reached the ground floor, she heard footsteps. Her heart raced as she recognized Mr. Johnson's bulky silhouette at the end of the hallway. "Where do you think you're going, you little rascal?" His voice thundered through the empty hallway. Emily didn't answer. Gathering all her strength, she ran towards the main door. Her lungs burned, and she could taste the metallic tang of blood in her mouth, but she didn't stop. She heard Mr. Johnson's heavy footsteps behind her, but she managed to reach the door before he could catch her. The rain hit her like 1,000 icy needles. Her shaky legs almost buckled when she stepped down the entrance steps, but she stood firm. The man in the wheelchair was still there, now completely soaked. "Hey!" Emily shouted, her weak voice almost lost in the noise of the storm. "Let me help you." The man raised his head, surprised to see such a small girl approaching. Emily reached him and, with a strength she didn't know she possessed, began to push the wheelchair, trying to get it out of the pothole. "You insolent brat!" Mr. Johnson's voice cut through the night. He had reached the orphanage entrance and was now descending the steps, his face red with anger. Emily felt panic rising, but she didn't abandon the man in the wheelchair. Her small, cold hands continued pushing until finally the wheels came loose. It was at that moment that headlights illuminated the street, and a black, luxurious car stopped abruptly beside them. "Mr. Sterling!" A well-dressed man got out of the car, rushing to help. "Thank God we found you!" Emily took a step back, trembling violently now. The rain had completely soaked her thin clothes, and she could barely stand. Her eyes met those of the man in the wheelchair. They were kind eyes, looking at her with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "What's your name, little one?" he asked, his voice weak but gentle. "Emily," she replied, before feeling a strong hand grab her arm. "Now you're going to get it, you pest!" Mr. Johnson pulled her violently, his nails digging into the thin skin of her arm. Emily let out a moan of pain, but before she could say anything, a strong dizziness hit her. The headlights began to spin, and she felt her legs buckle. The last thing she saw were the worried eyes of the man in the wheelchair before everything plunged into darkness. Emily woke up, feeling her body aching and her head heavy. The faint light filtering through the dormitory window hurt her eyes, and it took her a few seconds to realize she was lying in her narrow bed. The memories of the previous night came back in flashes. The rain, the man in the wheelchair, Mr. Johnson's anger. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain made her groan. "Stay still," a gruff voice said. It was Ms. Davis, the staff member in charge of the orphanage infirmary. "You have a high fever. If you keep behaving like this, you won't last long." Emily swallowed hard, feeling her throat scratch. Her eyes scanned the empty dormitory. The other children must already be in the cafeteria having breakfast. Ms. Davis approached with a glass of water and 2 pills. "Take these. It's all I can do for you right now." There was a tone of resignation in her voice. "The medication for your treatment is gone, and the orphanage doesn't have the money to buy more." Panic began to grow in Emily's chest. Without the medication, the disease would progress faster. She had already seen it happen to other children in the orphanage, children who one day simply disappeared, taken to hospitals from which they never returned. "But," Emily began to speak, her voice trembling. "No buts," Miss Davis interrupted. "You should be grateful you're still here. After your adventure last night, Mr. Johnson wanted to send you somewhere else. It was the director who wouldn't let him." Emily tried to swallow the pills, but they seemed to tear at her throat. Tears began to roll silently down her face. They weren't tears of fear of death. She had already gotten used to that possibility. They were tears of frustration for not being able to help that man in the wheelchair more, for having fainted before knowing if he was okay. The day dragged on slowly. Emily remained in bed, watching the window and recalling the events of the previous night. The man had kind eyes, unlike anyone she had ever met in the orphanage. His eyes conveyed a deep sadness, but also a kindness that Emily immediately recognized. In the afternoon, raised voices in the hallway caught her attention. She recognized the strident voice of the director, Ms. Thompson, mixed with others she didn't know. The voices were approaching the dormitory. "Sir, I understand your concern, but we can't simply—" Ms. Thompson was interrupted by a firm male voice. "You don't understand anything. I saw how you treat the children here. I saw it with my own eyes last night." The dormitory door opened, and Emily felt her heart leap. It was him, the man from the wheelchair. He looked different now, wearing elegant, well-pressed clothes. Beside him, in addition to the visibly nervous director, was the same well-dressed man from the night before, and a woman carrying a briefcase. "Emily," he said, his face lighting up as he saw her. "I came to thank you personally for what you did yesterday." "Mr. Sterling," Ms. Thompson tried to intervene. "The girl needs to rest. She's not well. She's not well because you don't take care of her properly." "Mr. Sterling replied, his voice filled with restrained anger. "Dr. Miller, please." The woman with the briefcase approached Emily's bed. She was a doctor, Emily realized, and a very different one from the doctors she usually saw at the clinic. Her movements were gentle, and she smiled as she examined Emily. "How long has it been since you took your medication, dear?" the doctor asked, after finishing the examination. "The medication ran out last week," Emily replied softly, avoiding looking at Ms. Thompson. The doctor exchanged a meaningful look with Mr. Sterling, who pressed his lips into a thin line. "As I suspected," he said. "Doctor, can you please explain to the director what happens when a child with leukemia goes without treatment?" Emily's eyes widened. No one in the orphanage used that word, leukemia. They only said she was sick, that she needed special care. But she knew what it was. She had researched it secretly in the school library before she became too weak to continue attending classes. The doctor began to explain in technical terms the severity of the situation. but was interrupted by Mr. Sterling. "In simple terms, Doctor, I want everyone here to understand exactly what is happening to this child. Without proper treatment," the doctor said, her voice now firmer, "Emily has only a few weeks to live, and they will be weeks of intense pain and suffering." The silence that followed was heavy. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She knew she was sick, but no one had ever been so direct about her condition. "That's not going to happen," Mr. Sterling declared, his voice filled with determination. "I brought all the necessary documents. Emily needs to be transferred to a proper hospital immediately." "But sir," Ms. Thompson tried to argue, "there are procedures, red tape." "The red tape can wait," Mr. Sterling interrupted. "Her life can't." It was then that Mr. Johnson appeared at the dormitory door, his face red with anger at seeing Mr. Sterling. "You can't just come in here giving orders. You don't have the right." Mr. Sterling turned his wheelchair to face the employee. "You're the man who was here last night, aren't you? The one who threatened a sick child who was just trying to help someone." Mr. Johnson took a step back, surprised by the direct confrontation. I was just following the orphanage rules." "The rules?" Mr. Sterling laughed humorlessly. "Do the rules include neglect and cruelty? Because that's what I saw last night. And I have witnesses." Mr. Sterling's assistant stepped forward, holding an envelope. "We have security camera footage from my car, which clearly shows you assaulting a sick child." Emily watched the scene with a mixture of fear and hope. No one had ever confronted Mr. Johnson like that. The employee seemed smaller now, cornered, his usual arrogance replaced by visible fear. "Emily," Mr. Sterling turned to her, his voice softening, "do you want to go to a place where they can treat you properly, where you don't have to be cold or go without your medication?" Emily felt tears returning to her eyes, but this time they were different. For the first time in a long time, they were tears of hope. She nodded, unable to form words. "Great," Mr. Sterling smiled, a gentle smile that reached his eyes. "Dr. Miller, is she in a condition to be transported?" "Yes, but we need to be careful. I'll accompany her personally." It was at that moment that Ms. Thompson made her last attempt. "And who's going to pay for all these expenses? The orphanage doesn't have the resources." "I will," Mr. Sterling replied simply. "Every single penny." Emily felt a wave of dizziness, but this time it wasn't from the disease. It was the feeling that her life was about to change completely. While the doctor and Mr. Sterling's assistant began preparing everything for her transfer, she couldn't take her eyes off the man in the wheelchair. There was something in his eyes, something she recognized but couldn't explain. What Emily didn't know was that this was just the beginning. The battle that was to come would be much harder than anyone could imagine, and it would test not only her strength, but also Mr. Sterling's determination in a way that no one expected. St. Luke's Hospital was very different from the clinic where Emily used to be treated. The walls were immaculately white, and the smell of disinfectant was milder, almost pleasant. Lying in a comfortable bed, with soft, clean sheets, Emily watched the doctors and nurses who came in and out of the room, performing examinations and checking her vital signs. Dr. Miller hadn't left her side since they left the orphanage. The doctor personally supervised every procedure, ensuring that Emily received all the necessary care. However, the expression on her face became more worried with each new test result that arrived. "The situation is more serious than we thought," Dr. Miller explained to Mr. Sterling, who remained in the room, his wheelchair positioned near the window. "The lack of proper treatment in recent months has allowed the disease to progress significantly." Emily pretended to be asleep, but listened to every word carefully. Her heart was beating fast in her chest, not from fear, but from a deep sadness. She didn't want Mr. Sterling, who had already done so much for her, to suffer even more because of her. "What are her chances?" Mr. Sterling asked, his voice tense. There was a moment of silence before Dr. Miller replied, "With proper treatment, which includes intensive chemotherapy and possibly a bone marrow transplant, maybe 30%. Emily felt a tear roll down the corner of her eye, but remained still. 30%. It was more than she expected to have at the orphanage, where her chances were zero. And without treatment? Mr. Sterling's voice was filled with emotion. Weeks, at most a month. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the constant beep of the monitors. Emily could almost feel the pain in Mr. Sterling's breath. "Start treatment immediately," he ordered. "Do whatever is necessary. Money is no object." "Mr. Sterling," Dr. Miller hesitated. "There's another matter we need to discuss. The treatment is intensive and prolonged. Emily will need a legal guardian to authorize the procedures. The orphanage no longer exists for her," Mr. Sterling interrupted. "I'll take responsibility. It's not that simple. There are legal, bureaucratic issues. You can't just—" "I can and I will," Mr. Sterling replied firmly. "My lawyers are already taking care of it." It was then that Emily couldn't pretend to be asleep any longer. A violent coughing fit made her sit up in bed, her small body shaking with the effort. In seconds, she felt the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. "Emily!" Mr. Sterling moved his chair quickly to her side, while Dr. Miller rushed to check her vital signs. "I'm sorry," Emily managed to say between coughing fits. "I didn't want to cause trouble." "Don't ever say that again." Mr. Sterling held her hand firmly. "You're not trouble, you're important." The cough finally subsided, leaving Emily exhausted. Dr. Miller adjusted the oxygen and administered medication through the IV. "This will help her rest," the doctor explained. "We need to start chemotherapy tomorrow morning. The sooner, the better." Emily squeezed Mr. Sterling's hand, feeling the fear grow in her chest. She knew what chemotherapy meant: more pain, more weakness, the loss of the little hair she had managed to keep. "I'll be here, Mr. Sterling promised, as if reading her thoughts. "I'm not going anywhere." The next morning, when the first rays of sunlight entered the hospital window, Emily woke up and discovered that Mr. Sterling really hadn't left. He was sleeping in his wheelchair, in a position that seemed uncomfortable, but his face showed determination even in his sleep. The first chemotherapy session was brutal. Emily felt as if her body was being burned from the inside, every cell screaming in protest. She vomited several times, and the weakness was so great that she could barely lift her head from the pillow. But Mr. Sterling remained by her side, holding her hand, telling stories to distract her from the pain. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The treatment continued, relentless in its intensity. Emily had lost weight, and her skin was so pale that it seemed transparent. But there was something in her eyes, a strength that grew with each day, fueled by the constant presence of Mr. Sterling. However, not everything was victories. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult chemotherapy session, Emily heard an argument in the hallway. It was Mr. Sterling's voice, raised as she had never heard it before. "How can you not have found a matching donor? Did you search all the databases?" "Mr. Sterling," it was Dr. Miller's voice, "we did an extensive search. The type of marrow that Emily needs is rare. Without a matching donor, her chances—" "No!" Mr. Sterling almost shouted. "There must be a way. There's always a way." Emily closed her eyes tightly, feeling the weight of guilt in her chest. Mr. Sterling had already done so much for her, and now he was suffering because not all his money and influence could create a matching donor out of thin air. That night, when Mr. Sterling returned to the room, Emily noticed that his eyes were red, as if he had been crying. She pretended not to notice, just as he pretended not to see when she cried in pain during the night. "You know," she said, her voice weak but determined, "the cleaning lady told me that you haven't left the hospital since I arrived, that you turned one of the rooms into an office and run your business from here." Mr. Sterling smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "That's true. I can't leave my little warrior alone, can I? But what about your life, your family?" Mr. Sterling's smile faltered slightly. "You are my family now, Emily, even if the papers don't say that yet." It was then that Emily understood what she saw in his eyes. It was the same as what she felt, loneliness, a deep loneliness that was beginning to be filled by each other's presence. But along with that understanding came an even greater fear, the fear of leaving, and leaving him alone again. What Emily didn't know was that, at that very moment, a series of events was about to unfold, events that would test not only her physical strength, but also the bonds that she and Mr. Sterling had built. Fate still had cards to play, and not all of them would be easy to accept. The news arrived on an autumn morning, when the leaves of the trees in the hospital garden were beginning to turn yellow. Emily was having a particularly difficult day. The last chemotherapy session had been stronger than the previous ones, leaving her so weak that she could barely keep her eyes open. Mr. Sterling was by her side, as always, trying to get her to eat a few spoonfuls of soup. "Just one more spoonful," he insisted gently, his voice full of concern. "You need to keep your strength up." Emily tried to swallow, but her stomach churned violently. In seconds, all the effort of the last hour was lost as she began to vomit. Mr. Sterling quickly grabbed a kidney basin and held her head, murmuring words of comfort as she trembled. It was at that moment that Dr. Miller entered the room, her face lit up by something that looked like hope, an expression that hadn't been seen in that hospital room for a long time. "We found it," she announced, barely containing the excitement in her voice. "We found a matching donor. Mr. Sterling dropped the spoon he was holding, the sound of the metal against the floor, echoing in the sudden silence that followed. Emily, still weak and trembling, looked at the doctor with wide eyes. "Are you sure?" Mr. Sterling asked, his voice choked with emotion. "The compatibility." 99%, Dr. Miller confirmed. "It's almost a miracle. The donor is in Los Angeles and has already agreed to do the procedure. We can perform the transplant within 2 weeks, as soon as Emily is strong enough." The news should have brought only joy, but Emily immediately noticed the change in Mr. Sterling's posture. There was tension in his shoulders, and his hands squeezed the arms of the wheelchair tightly. 2 weeks, he repeated, as if savoring the words. "What's the success rate?" Dr. Miller hesitated for a moment. "With such a compatible donor, the chances increase considerably, but the procedure itself is very risky, especially considering Emily's debilitated state." "How much?" Mr. Sterling insisted. 50%, the doctor finally replied. "But without the transplant—" "I know," Mr. Sterling interrupted her. He didn't need to hear again that without the transplant, Emily wouldn't have any chance at all. After Dr. Miller left, a heavy silence fell over the room. Emily watched Mr. Sterling, who had his eyes fixed on the window, lost in thought. She could see the internal battle he was fighting, the hope of a cure, fighting against the fear of losing her on the operating table. "You don't have to be afraid," Emily said softly, surprising Mr. Sterling. "I'm not." He turned his chair to face her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "How can you not be afraid?" "Because I've already won," she replied with a wisdom beyond her years. "When you took me out of the orphanage, I had already won. Everything after that is a bonus." Mr. Sterling moved his chair closer to the bed, taking Emily's small, frail hand between his. "You can't give up. You have to fight." "And I will fight," she promised. "But not for me, for you." The 2 weeks that followed were a roller coaster of emotions. Emily needed to undergo a series of examinations and preparatory procedures for the transplant, each one more exhausting than the other. Her body, already so fragile, seemed to be pushed to its limit. Mr. Sterling hardly slept anymore. Even when Emily managed to rest, he remained awake, watching her every breath, as if he feared that she might disappear if he closed his eyes. The nurses tried to convince him to go home and rest, but he flatly refused. One night, when Emily's fever was particularly high, she began to hallucinate. In her semi-conscious state, she called for a mother she had never known, cried for a father she never had. Mr. Sterling held her hand, feeling completely helpless in the face of so much suffering. "Why don't you want me?" Emily murmured in her delirium. "Why doesn't anyone want me?" "I want you," Mr. Sterling replied, the tears finally escaping. "I want you more than anything in this life." It was on this night that he made a decision. As soon as dawn broke, he called his lawyers. No matter how much red tape there was, how many obstacles he had to face, he would make Emily his legal daughter. She needed to know that she belonged to someone, that she was loved unconditionally. However, fate had other plans. On the morning of the day the adoption papers were to begin to be prepared, Emily woke up with a stabbing pain in her chest. The monitors began to beep frantically, and in seconds the room was full of doctors and nurses. "She's having a severe reaction to the last dose of chemotherapy," Dr. Miller explained quickly as the team worked. "We need to stabilize her before it's too late." Mr. Sterling watched, helpless in his wheelchair, as the medical team fought to save Emily's life. Each second seemed like an eternity. Each beep of the monitor was like a stab in his heart. "Not now," he murmured repeatedly. "Please, not now. I haven't had enough time with her yet." After what seemed like an eternity, Emily's vital signs began to stabilize, but Dr. Miller had bad news. "We can't wait 2 more weeks," she said, her face grave. "The transplant needs to be done immediately, or she won't make it." "But she's too weak," Mr. Sterling protested. "It's our only chance," the doctor replied. "The donor is already on their way. We're going to do the transplant tomorrow morning." That night, Mr. Sterling didn't leave Emily's side for a single second. She was semi-conscious, floating between reality and the delirium caused by the fever. In a moment of clarity, she opened her eyes and looked directly at him. "If I don't make it," she began, but Mr. Sterling interrupted her. "Don't say that. You will make it." "Listen to me," she insisted, her voice no more than a whisper. "If I don't make it, I want you to know that you gave me the only thing I ever wanted in life." "What?" he asked, his voice trembling. "A father." Mr. Sterling felt as if his heart was being ripped from his chest. He wanted to say so many things, make so many promises, but the words were stuck in his throat. All he could do was hold her hand tighter, as if he could, through that gesture, convey all the love he felt. The night wore on slowly, and with it grew the anxiety for what the dawn would bring. What neither of them knew was that the next day would bring much more than just the transplant. It would bring a twist that no one could have predicted. The day of the transplant dawned cloudy, as if the sky itself shared the apprehension that hung over St. Luke's Hospital. Emily was awakened early in the morning by a team of nurses who began to prepare her for the procedure. Her small and fragile body trembled, not from fear, but from fever and exhaustion. Mr. Sterling hadn't slept. His deep, dark circles and pale face betrayed consecutive nights of vigil. He watched every movement of the nurses with obsessive attention, as if trying to memorize every detail, every second spent with Emily. "It's time," Dr. Miller announced, entering the room with a clipboard in her hands. "The donor has arrived and is being prepared in the other room." Emily tried to sit up in bed, but she didn't have the strength. One of the nurses helped her, adjusting the pillows behind her back. Her face was so pale that it seemed almost transparent, the blue veins visible under her thin skin. "Can I see the donor?" she asked, her voice no more than a whisper. Dr. Miller shook her head. "I'm sorry, dear. Protocol requires complete anonymity. It's to protect both you and the donor." Mr. Sterling moved his wheelchair closer to the bed, taking Emily's hand between his. It was cold, fragile, like an injured bird. "Emily," he began, his voice choked with emotion. "I need to tell you something before—" "No," she interrupted him gently. "Don't say anything now. Tell me later." "But, please," she insisted, her dark eyes fixed on his. "Give me a reason to come back." Mr. Sterling swallowed hard, feeling the tears he had been trying to contain for days finally begin to fall. "You're right. Later. We'll have all the time in the world later." The nurses began to release the brakes on the bed, preparing to take her to the surgical center. Mr. Sterling held Emily's hand until the last possible moment, only letting go when the elevator doors began to close. "I love you, Dad," Emily said at the last instant. The doors closed before Mr. Sterling could respond, taking Emily to what could be both her salvation and her end. The hours that followed were the longest of Mr. Sterling's life. He remained in the hallway of the surgical center, his wheelchair positioned facing the doors through which Emily had disappeared. Every time someone passed, his heart leaped, hoping for news. Dr. Miller came out occasionally to give updates, but they were always the same vague words. "The procedure is proceeding as expected. Vital signs are stable. We're doing everything we can." In the 4th hour of waiting, Ricardo, Mr. Sterling's personal assistant, arrived with a folder of documents. "Sir, the lawyers managed to expedite the adoption process," he said in a low voice. "They just need your signature on a few documents." Mr. A. Sterling took the pen with trembling hands, signing paper after paper without even reading them. Nothing else mattered besides giving Emily the family she deserved, the love she never had. It was when he was signing the last document that the doors of the surgical center opened violently. Dr. Miller ran out, shouting orders to the team. "She's going into shock. We need more blood now." Mr. Sterling felt the world spin. "What's happening?" he shouted, but no one stopped to answer. The next minutes were a blur of frenetic activity. Nurses ran with bags of blood. Doctors rushed in and out of the surgical center. The hallway, once silent, was now full of raised voices and the sound of equipment being moved. "Her body is rejecting the marrow," Mr. Sterling heard someone say. "The pressure is dropping rapidly." "We can't lose this girl," Dr. Miller's voice sounded firm over the chaos. "Do everything necessary." Mr. Sterling remained motionless in his wheelchair, feeling more helpless than ever. All his money, all his power meant nothing at that moment. Emily's life was in the hands of other people, and he could do absolutely nothing to help. Another hour passed, and then another. The movement in the hallway gradually diminished until only silence remained. A heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Finally, Dr. Miller came out of the surgical center. Her face was pale, and her hands, normally so steady, trembled slightly. She walked slowly to Mr. Sterling, and for a terrible moment, he thought all was lost. "We managed to stabilize her," the doctor said finally. But, Mr. Sterling could barely breathe. "The next 48 hours will be critical. Her body reacted violently to the transplant. If she survives this initial phase, the chances are good. But if not..." Mr. Sterling closed his eyes, feeling as if each word was a stab in his heart. "Can I see her?" "She's in the ICU, completely sedated on life support. She won't wake up anytime soon if..." "It doesn't matter," he interrupted. "I need to be by her side." Dr. Miller nodded, understanding. "I'll take you there." The ICU was an even more antiseptic and silent environment than the rest of the hospital. The only sound was the constant beep of the monitors and the soft hum of the machines that kept Emily alive. When Mr. Sterling saw her, his heart almost stopped. Emily seemed to have shrunk even further, if that was possible. Tubes and wires came out of her body from all sides, and her skin had a grayish tone that frightened him. "My little one," he whispered, positioning his chair next to the bed. "You need to fight. You need to come back to me." The hours dragged on with torturous slowness. Mr. Sterling didn't leave Emily's side for a minute, watching every small change in her vital signs, every fluctuation in the numbers on the monitors. At the end of the first day, the fever began to rise. The doctors increased the medication, but Emily's body seemed to be waging a fierce battle against the new genetic material it had received. "Her immune system is very weakened," Dr. Miller explained. The fight against the disease had already consumed almost all of her reserves. Now, with the transplant, Mr. Sterling barely heard the medical explanations. His eyes were fixed on Emily's face, looking for any sign that she was still there, still fighting. It was during the second night that the first alarm sounded. The heart monitor began to beep frantically, and in seconds, the ICU was full of doctors and nurses again. "Fibrillation!" someone shouted. "We need to resuscitate!" Mr. Sterling was forced to move away from the bed, watching helplessly as the medical team fought to bring Emily back. Each second seemed like an eternity. Each sound of the defibrillator was like a blow to his own heart. What no one knew was that, while her body fought to survive, Emily's mind wandered through a place between life and death, where memories and dreams mingled. And it was in that place that something extraordinary began to happen. Something that would change not only her life, but that of everyone around her. The third day after the transplant brought a subtle but significant change. Emily's fever, which had remained dangerously high, began to subside slowly. It was an improvement so small that it could go unnoticed to anyone, but not to Mr. Sterling, who had memorized every number, every fluctuation on the monitors that surrounded the bed of his little warrior. Dr. Miller was making her morning rounds when she noticed the change. She examined the latest test results with redoubled attention, her face assuming an expression that mixed surprise and caution. "It's extraordinary," she murmured, more to herself than to Mr. Sterling. "Her body is starting to accept the marrow." Mr. Sterling, who hadn't left his post next to Emily's bed for a moment, felt his heart race. "Does that mean—" "We can't celebrate yet," Dr. Miller interrupted him gently. "It's a good sign, yes, but Emily is still very fragile. The recovery process, if it happens, will be long and difficult." The doctor paused, observing Emily's vital signs once more before continuing. "However, there's something I need to discuss with you. Something about the donor." Mr. Sterling felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in the doctor's tone of voice that made him instantly alert. "What about her?" "She," Dr. Miller corrected gently. "The donor is a woman, and she's here in the hospital, recovering from surgery on the other floor." "So? And she's asking to see Emily." Mr. Sterling frowned. "But doesn't protocol require anonymity?" "Yes, but—" Dr. Miller hesitated, as if carefully choosing her next words. "There are exceptional circumstances that may justify a breach of protocol. This is one of them." "What circumstances?" Before Dr. Miller could answer, a faint sound caught both their attention. Emily had moved slightly in bed, her fingers twitching almost imperceptibly. "Emily?" Mr. Sterling leaned forward in his wheelchair, his heart beating erratically. "Can you hear me, little one?" Emily's eyes remained closed, but her lips moved slightly as if trying to speak. Dr. Miller quickly began to check her vital signs. "She's trying to wake up," the doctor explained. "It's a good sign, but we need to be careful. Her body is still very weak." The next hours were a roller coaster of emotions. Emily alternated between moments of near consciousness and long periods of deep sleep. Every time she stirred, Mr. Sterling held his breath, hoping she would finally open her eyes. It was during one of these moments of agitation that something unexpected happened. Emily began to murmur disjointed words, her voice so low that it was almost inaudible. "Mommy," she whispered. "Mommy, don't go." Mr. Sterling felt his heart clench. In all the months they had spent together, Emily had never mentioned her mother. He knew only what was stated in the orphanage records, that she had been abandoned as a baby, without any information about her biological parents. "She's delirious," Dr. Miller explained, adjusting the IV drip. "It's normal at this stage of recovery," but there was something in the doctor's face that made Mr. Sterling uneasy. It was as if she knew something she wasn't saying. "Doctor," he called as she was about to leave the room, "what's going on? What aren't you telling me?" Dr. Miller stopped at the door, her shoulders visibly tense. After a moment of hesitation, she returned and sat in a chair near Mr. Sterling. "The donor," she began, her voice low and controlled, "is not just anyone from the database. She volunteered when she learned about Emily's case through a news story about the orphanage." Mr. Sterling felt his stomach churn. "Who is she?" "She is—" Dr. Miller paused, as if seeking courage to continue. "She is Emily's biological mother." The impact of those words was like a punch to Mr. Sterling's gut. For a few seconds he couldn't breathe. "Impossible," he finally managed to say. "The orphanage records are incomplete," Dr. Miller completed, "or perhaps deliberately altered. The story is complicated." At that moment, Emily stirred again in bed. Her eyes moved rapidly under her closed eyelids, as if she were dreaming. "She has the right to know," the doctor continued. "And the mother, she's very sick, Mr. Sterling. The donation procedure was risky in her state, but she insisted. She said it was her last chance to do something for her daughter." Mr. Sterling looked at Emily, so small and fragile in the hospital bed. His whole world had transformed the moment she entered his life, and now everything could change again. "How long?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "The doctors give her a few weeks at most. Her disease is terminal. That's why she never looked for Emily before. She didn't want her daughter to see her die." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the constant beep of the monitors. Mr. Sterling felt as if he were in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. "If Emily survives," he said finally, "this will destroy her. Losing her mother right after finding her, or it might be exactly what she needs." Dr. Miller replied softly. "A chance to understand her origins, to know that she was never abandoned for lack of love." Before Mr. Sterling could respond, a high-pitched sound cut through the air. The monitors began to beep frantically, and Emily's body began to convulse in bed. "She's having a reaction," Dr. Miller shouted, running to hit the emergency button. "We need the team in here now." In seconds, the room was full of doctors and nurses. Mr. Sterling was forced to retreat with his wheelchair, watching helplessly as the team fought to stabilize Emily. What no one realized in the midst of the chaos was that Emily's lips continued to move, forming a single word over and over again. "Mommy." The night would be long, and the revelations that were to come would forever change the destiny of all involved in this story. But for now, the only thing that mattered was keeping Emily alive, giving her the chance to discover all the truths that fate had kept hidden for so long. Morning arrived, bringing a tense calm to the ICU room. After the crisis the night before, Emily had finally stabilized, although she remained unconscious. Mr. Sterling hadn't closed his eyes, fearing that any moment of carelessness could be fatal. His back ached from the uncomfortable position in the wheelchair, but he barely noticed the physical discomfort. His mind was consumed by thoughts about Dr. Miller's revelation. The soft sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled him from his thoughts. Through the half-open door, he saw a woman in a wheelchair being pushed by a nurse. Even at a distance, and clearly weakened by the disease, it was impossible not to notice the resemblance. She had Emily's same eyes, the same delicate shape of the face. "She's here," the nurse announced softly, stopping at the door. Mr. Sterling felt his heart clench as he saw the woman's condition. She appeared to be in her early 40s, but the disease had aged her prematurely. She was extremely thin, with a pallor that betrayed her serious condition. Still, there was a strength in her gaze that was very reminiscent of Emily's. "My name is Eleanor," she said, her voice trembling but determined. I'm her mother." Mr. Sterling nodded slightly, unable to form words for a moment. The nurse pushed Eleanor's chair into the room, positioning it on the other side of Emily's bed. "She's so beautiful," Eleanor whispered, her eyes fixed on her daughter's pale face. Tears began to roll down her sunken cheeks. "I dreamed of this moment so many times." "Why?" The question escaped Mr. Sterling's lips before he could contain it. "Why did you abandon her?" Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment as if gathering strength to tell her story. When she opened them again, they were filled with an ancient and deep pain. "I was 19 years old when Emily was born," she began. "I was young, alone, and had just found out that I was sick. The doctors said it was a rare form of cancer, that I had only a few months to live." She paused, swallowing hard. "I had no family, no money for treatment. How could I take care of a baby?" Mr. Sterling listened in silence, his heart divided between compassion and anger. Eleanor continued, "I thought I was doing what was best for her. The orphanage seemed like a decent place at the time, and I believed that she would have a chance to be adopted by a family that could give her everything I couldn't." "But you survived," Mr. Sterling observed. "Yes," Eleanor smiled sadly. "Against all odds, the experimental treatment I received worked. It didn't cure me, but it gave me more time, much more than the doctors expected. When I went back to the orphanage a year later, they said that Emily had been adopted by a family from the South." Mr. Sterling frowned. "But that's not true. She was never adopted." "I found that out only a few weeks ago," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "I saw a news report about the orphanage on television, talking about the poor conditions and the sick children, and there she was, my Emily, so much like me when I was young. When I found out she had leukemia." Her voice completely failed. At that moment, a soft sound came from the bed. Emily had moved slightly, her fingers twitching on the sheet. Both Mr. Sterling and Eleanor held their breath. "Emily," Mr. Sterling called softly, "can you hear us, little one?" Slowly, as if emerging from a very deep sleep, Emily's eyes began to open. They were blurred, confused, but there was a glimmer of consciousness in them that hadn't been present in recent days. "Dad," she whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. Mr. Sterling held her hand, feeling the tears running down his face. "I'm here, my little one. I'm here." Emily blinked a few times, trying to focus her vision. It was then that her eyes met Eleanor's on the other side of the bed. For a moment, there was only silence, a silence charged with decades of absence, of unanswered questions, of love stifled by time and circumstances. "I know you," Emily said finally, her voice little more than a whisper. "From my dreams." Eleanor sobbed, unable to contain her emotion. "Yes, my love, it's me, your mother." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to process that information. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears. "Why?" she asked, the same question that Mr. Sterling had asked minutes before. Eleanor reached out her trembling hand, touching Emily's face gently, as if fearing that she might disappear at any moment. "Because I loved you too much to make you go through what I was going through," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. "Because I thought I was dying, and I didn't want your first memory to be seeing your mother wither away in a hospital bed." Emily looked at Mr. Sterling, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Dad?" "It's okay," he assured, squeezing her hand gently. "Your mother, she's the bone marrow donor who's saving you. She gave you life twice." Understanding slowly dawned on Emily's face. You saved me." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When she finally found her voice, it was filled with emotion. "It was the least I could do after all these years. When I found out you were sick, I couldn't allow history to repeat itself. But now—" Emily hesitated, her eyes studying her mother's weakened face. "You're still sick." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with a truth that no one wanted to say out loud. It was Mr. Sterling who finally spoke. "Your mother was very brave to make the donation, Emily. She risked a lot to save you." Is everything going to be okay?" Emily asked, her eyes darting between Mr. Sterling and Eleanor. Eleanor smiled sadly, caressing her daughter's face. "What matters is that you're going to be okay, my love. It's all I've ever wanted." Emily closed her eyes, tears running down her pale cheeks. When she opened them again, there was a familiar determination in her gaze, the same determination that Mr. Sterling had learned to admire. "No," she said, her voice weak but firm. "I don't want to lose you again. Not now that I've found you." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Miller, who entered the room to check Emily's vital signs. Her eyes widened as she saw the patient awake and conscious. "This is extraordinary," she murmured, examining the monitors. "The new marrow is being accepted much better than we expected. It's almost as if her body recognizes—" She stopped in mid-sentence, but everyone in the room understood what she meant. Emily's body recognized her mother's marrow, as if it knew on a cellular level that that genetic material was part of her. Night was beginning to fall over the hospital, but no one in the room seemed to notice the passage of time. Emily had fallen asleep again, but this time it was a natural, peaceful sleep. Her hands still held those of Mr. Sterling and Eleanor, as if even unconscious, she didn't want to let either of them go. What no one knew was that this moment of peace was only temporary. The days to come would bring even greater challenges and decisions that would forever change the lives of all involved. The days that followed the meeting between Emily and Eleanor were marked by a bittersweet mixture of joy and sadness. Emily's recovery progressed almost miraculously. Her tests showed constant improvement, and her strength increased day by day. However, the same could not be said of Eleanor. The strain of the donation procedure had taken a heavy toll on her already weakened body. With each passing day, she became weaker, paler, but she refused to return to her own room in the hospital, preferring to spend every possible moment with the daughter she had just reunited with. "You need to rest, Mr. Sterling insisted, worried about Eleanor's increasingly fragile state. "I've rested for 9 years, she replied, always with a sad smile. "I'm not going to waste another minute." Emily watched her mother with a mixture of newfound love and growing concern. Even at only 9 years old, she could sense that something was wrong. She saw the worried glances that the doctors exchanged when they examined Eleanor, noticed how the nurses spoke in whispers when they thought no one was listening. One afternoon, while Eleanor had been taken for tests, Emily finally mustered the courage to ask the question that haunted her. "Dad," she called to Mr. Sterling, who was reading a book next to her bed. "My mum is going to die, isn't she?" Mr. Sterling felt his heart clench. He had promised himself never to lie to Emily, but how to tell the truth at that moment? "Emily," he began, but she interrupted him. "You don't need to try to protect me," she said, her voice small but firm. "I see how she's getting weaker. It's the same as what happened to Sarah at the orphanage." Mr. Sterling remembered the story that Emily had told about her friend from the orphanage who had died of pneumonia a few months before. He realized that he couldn't hide the truth from her. "Yes, little one," he replied finally. "Your mother is very sick. The doctors are doing everything they can, but—" "How long?" Emily asked, silent tears running down her face. "We don't know for sure. A few weeks, maybe?" Emily was silent for a long moment, processing the information. When she spoke again, her voice was filled with a determination that surprised Mr. Sterling. "Then we need to make every day count." From that day on, something changed in the hospital room. Emily, even still recovering, began to plan little surprises for Eleanor. With the help of Mr. Sterling and the nurses, she transformed each moment into something special. One day, they managed to turn the room into a makeshift movie theater, complete with drawn curtains and popcorn. They watched together Eleanor's favorite movie, which she had mentioned in one of their conversations. On another day, Emily convinced the nurses to let her and Eleanor do finger painting with watercolors. They all ended up covered in paint, including Mr. Sterling, but the laughter they shared made every stain worth it. Eleanor, in turn, took advantage of every moment to share stories with her daughter. She told about her own childhood, about how she had chosen the name Emily, "because it means striving, and I knew you would be a very special girl," about the months of pregnancy and how she had talked to her belly every night. "I used to sing to you," Eleanor said one night, her voice already quite weak. "Always the same lullaby that my grandmother sang to me." And then, to everyone's surprise, she began to sing softly, her voice trembling but still sweet. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky." Emily closed her eyes, letting the tears run freely. Something inside her recognized that melody as if it were part of her oldest and deepest memories. Mr. Sterling watched the scene with a broken heart. He saw the immense love between mother and daughter, a love that had been denied for so long and now had such a short expiration date. It was on a particularly difficult morning that Eleanor asked to speak with Mr. Sterling in private. Emily was sleeping, exhausted after a restless night. "I need you to promise me something," Eleanor said, her voice no more than a whisper. "Anything," Mr. Sterling replied, noticing how she was even paler than normal. "Promise that you will tell her about me, that you will keep my memory alive, that you will make her understand that every moment away from her was an agony, but that I never, never stopped loving her." Mr. Sterling felt the tears fill his eyes. "I promise, and promise." Eleanor hesitated, gathering strength. "Promise that you will love her for both of us, that you will give her all the love that I couldn't give her in these 9 years." "That," Mr. Sterling replied, his voice choked with emotion, "that I've been doing since the first day." Eleanor smiled, a weak but peaceful smile. "I know. That's why I can leave peacefully, because I know that my Emily has the best father she could have." That afternoon, as the sun began to set, Eleanor asked for her bed to be placed next to Emily's. The nurses, understanding the gravity of the moment, provided the arrangement. Mother and daughter held hands, talking quietly, sharing smiles and tears. Mr. Sterling remained in his wheelchair, a silent guardian of that precious moment. What no one knew was that fate still had one last surprise reserved, a twist that no one could have foreseen, and that would forever change the lives of all involved. Night fell over St. Luke's Hospital, bringing with it a fine and persistent rain, much like the one that fell on the night Emily and Mr. Sterling met. Eleanor had finally fallen asleep, her breathing weak but regular, her hands still intertwined with her daughter's. Emily struggled against sleep, determined not to miss even a moment by her mother's side. Mr. Sterling watched the two, his heart heavy with the certainty that those precious moments were coming to an end. It was then that Dr. Miller entered the room, carrying a folder with test results. There was something different in her expression, a mixture of confusion and hope that caught Mr. Sterling's attention immediately. "We need to talk," she said in a low voice, gesturing for him to follow her into the hallway. Once outside the room, Dr. Miller opened the folder and began to spread tests over a small table. "This is extraordinary," she murmured, more to herself than to Mr. Sterling. "In 30 years of medicine, I've never seen anything like it." "What is it?" Mr. Sterling asked, his heart racing. "Eleanor's latest tests," the doctor replied, pointing to a series of images. "Look at this. The cancer cells, they're regressing." Mr. Sterling blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "We don't know for sure, but it seems that the bone marrow donation process, something happened during the procedure. Her immune system is responding in a completely unexpected way." "Are you saying she's getting better?" Dr. Miller hesitated. "It's more complicated than that. Her cancer is extremely aggressive. That's why no previous treatment worked. But now, it's as if the donation process has awakened some kind of response in her body. We need to run more tests to understand exactly what's happening." At that moment, a sound from the room caught their attention. It was Eleanor, coughing violently. Mr. Sterling rushed back inside, fearing the worst, but what he saw left him speechless. Eleanor was sitting up in bed, her cheeks slightly flushed, a hint of life that hadn't been seen on her face in weeks. Emily had also woken up and was looking at her mother with a mixture of concern and hope. "Sorry," Eleanor said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "I think I swallowed a bit of saliva wrong." Dr. Miller hurried to examine Eleanor, checking her vital signs with extra attention. "How are you feeling?" "Strange," Eleanor replied, frowning slightly. "Different, like something inside me is changing." In the weeks that followed, everyone at the hospital watched in stunned amazement what seemed like a true miracle. Tests continued to show a steady decrease in cancer cells in Eleanor's body. Her strength gradually returned, and with it the color in her cheeks and the sparkle in her eyes. "It's like the universe is giving us a second chance," Eleanor said one afternoon, while watching Emily sleep peacefully. "Like all the love I've saved for her over these 9 years is finally getting a chance to heal not only her, but me too." Mr. Sterling understood what she meant. There was something almost magical about the way mother and daughter had reconnected, as if their bodies and souls knew they belonged to each other even after so long apart. Emily, in turn, blossomed with each passing day. Her recovery, which was already surprising, seemed to gain new momentum as she saw her mother getting better. It was as if the two were healing together, sharing not only the genetic material of the marrow, but also the strength and determination to live. It was on a sunny morning, exactly 3 months after the transplant, that Dr. Miller entered the room with the biggest smile anyone had ever seen on her face. "The latest tests are in," she announced, barely containing her excitement. "Emily is officially in remission, and Eleanor—" She paused dramatically. "The cancer has practically disappeared. It's what we call complete remission." The room erupted in tears and laughter. Emily jumped from her bed to Eleanor's, the two hugging as if they never wanted to let go. Mr. Sterling watched the scene with his own face washed in tears of joy. "Does that mean we can go home?" Emily asked, her eyes shining with anticipation. It was then that silence fell over the room. The word home now carried a different weight. Where would they go? What would life be like from now on? "Well, Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. "About that, I have a surprise for you both." He took an envelope from inside his jacket and handed it to Emily. Inside were a series of legal documents, including the adoption papers he had signed weeks before. "These are your adoption papers," he explained, "but there's something else. Eleanor, I bought a house, a big house, with a beautiful garden near the hospital so we can continue with the follow-up treatments. There's enough room for all of us." Eleanor covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming freely down her face. "Mr. Sterling, I can't accept—" "Yes, you can," he interrupted gently. "I'm not offering this out of charity. I'm offering it because we're a family now. A somewhat different family, maybe, but still a family." Emily looked from one to the other, her face lit up with the purest happiness. "Does that mean I'm going to have my mum and my dad together?" "Yes, sweetheart," Mr. Sterling smiled. "It means you're never going to be alone again, that you'll have all the love you deserve, doubled." A month later, when they finally left the hospital, the sun was shining in the Chicago sky like it hadn't in a long time. Eleanor, although still needing a cane to support herself, walked on her own. Emily, with her hair beginning to grow back, skipped between her and Mr. Sterling, holding both their hands. When they arrived at the new house, they found a surprise. Dr. Miller and the entire hospital staff were there, along with a small group of other patients who had become friends during their stay. There was a banner hanging on the gate that read, "Welcome to your new life." Emily ran to explore the garden, her eyes shining as she discovered a treehouse that Mr. Sterling had built especially for her. Eleanor walked slowly across the lawn, breathing in the fresh air, feeling the sun on her face, sensations she thought she would never experience again. Mr. Sterling watched everything from his wheelchair, his heart overflowing with happiness. He remembered that rainy night when a little girl from the orphanage had risked her own life to help a stranger. Who could have imagined that that one act of kindness would lead to this? "What are you thinking about?" Eleanor asked, sitting on a bench near him. About how surprising life is, he replied. About how sometimes we need to go through so much suffering to find true happiness. Emily ran back to them, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mom! Dad! Come see what I found!" They smiled at each other before following the girl. They knew there were still challenges ahead. More doctor's appointments, more follow-up exams, more adjustments to their new life. But now they would face everything together as a family. And so, under the sun of that perfect afternoon, three souls that fate had separated finally found their place in the world, in each other. Because sometimes the real miracle isn't in the healing of the body, but in the healing of the heart. And in that unlikely family, formed by a child who never lost hope, a mother who never stopped loving, and a man who learned that true wealth lies in love, miracles happened every day, in every smile, in every hug, in every shared moment.